Cop tries to humiliate black woman, unaware she's a decorated military intelligence officer. The night air crackled with tension the moment Officer Brent Halley pulled over the glossy black SUV. He could barely see the driver, only aware of her silhouette against the glow of a passing street lamp. Something about the car, too fancy, too sleek, made him suspicious. As he approached, he rehearsed his usual lines in his head, that tone laced with condescension he thought would keep her in her place. Little did he know, this was no ordinary driver. This was Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Green, a decorated U.S. Army military intelligence officer, trained to spot threats and dismantle them before they ever took shape. Naomi Green's life had never been simple. Even before she joined the Army, she was the kind of person who was always on the move. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, she'd learned from a young age that the world didn't always offer second chances to girls who looked like her. But she had a fire in her eyes, and she had a conviction that she would rise above every barrier placed in her path. So when she left home at 18 and enrolled in the University of Maryland, she was fueled by a dream of joining the military. Her father had been a sergeant in the Marines before a knee injury ended his career. He'd taught her about self-discipline and patriotism, about standing up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. Naomi took every piece of advice, welded it onto her sense of self, and persevered. Fresh out of college with a degree in political science, Naomi joined the U.S. Army and headed straight into military intelligence. She trained tirelessly, focusing on cryptologic linguistics first, then expanding her skill set into counterintelligence. When officers looked at her, they saw discipline, brilliance, and unwavering determination. Despite the occasional prejudice from some corners of the service, her record spoke louder than any skeptic. She garnered promotions and commendations, culminating in her recent promotion to lieutenant colonel. And yet, for all her training, for all her accolades, Naomi had learned how to move quietly through civilian life. In her mind, there was no need to flaunt her rank and achievements to strangers, especially not if it risked overshadowing the very reason she'd earned those accolades in the first place. She wanted no special treatment, no illusions. She was proud of who she was, but that pride was a personal matter. On a breezy fall evening, having just returned stateside from a short deployment, Naomi was driving to her hometown in Georgia to surprise her father for his upcoming birthday. She drove a glossy black SUV, an early gift to herself after her last promotion, and kept her license and registration in a neat folder. It was late, the roads mostly empty, and she felt that sense of anticipation for homecoming. The old silver ring on her finger, a memento from her first tour overseas, glinted under the passing streetlights. She tapped gently on the steering wheel, humming along to an old R&B station. That's when she noticed red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A cold rush of adrenaline hit her chest. She wasn't speeding, hadn't changed lanes erratically. Why was she being pulled over? She reminded herself, stay calm, stay collected. She'd been through real combat zones, had outsmarted insurgents who'd tried to intercept critical intelligence. This should be nothing more than a routine traffic stop, she told herself. But the memory of how traffic stops sometimes ended for people who looked like her nagged at her mind. Still, Naomi pulled over onto the narrow shoulder. She turned off her music, put the car in park, and folded her hands in her lap. Her heart thumped in her ears, but her expression remained neutral. She was used to controlling her nerves under pressure. Outside her window, the policeman's silhouette was illuminated by the swirling red and blue haze of the patrol car's lights. He seemed to stand there for a moment, as though sizing her up through the tinted glass. Naomi rolled down her window, her driver's license and registration already in hand. Her life had always been extraordinary in some ways, but to outside eyes, she was just another driver on a lonely stretch of road. For Naomi, that was exactly how she liked it, until she discovered that anonymity could also be a weapon used against her. Officer Brent Halley prided himself on his instincts. In the small county police department, he believed he was the toughest, the most diligent, and the most deserving of respect. In his eyes, he had a duty to keep the peace. Yet his methods drew questions from colleagues and townspeople alike, who noticed he favored heavier enforcement against certain groups of people. He chalked it up to criminal statistics, never acknowledging his bias as something deeper and far uglier. Hallie's father had been a state trooper, and his grandfather too. His entire family lineage dripped with the authority of a badge. Growing up, Hallie was taught that wearing the uniform placed him in a special position of power. For him, this power was more than just a responsibility. It was a privilege that gave him license to treat people however he deemed fit. Tonight, as he cruised the long stretch of highway just outside of Atlanta, his eyes landed on the black SUV that Naomi was driving. Something about the expensive rims and the tinted windows set off Hallie's prejudice. In his mind, it was probably another punk from the city, up to no good in his county. He switched on the sirens and watched with grim satisfaction as the SUV slowed and pulled to the side. Before stepping out, he radioed in. "Pulling over a suspicious vehicle," he said. "Possibly stolen. Will advise once I have a read." There had been zero indication that Naomi's car was stolen. Hallie hadn't even run the plates yet, but he was playing a hunch fueled by ignorance and bigotry. As Hallie approached the driver's side, he tried to compose his face into an authoritarian scowl. The driver's window rolled down. With a flick of his flashlight, he saw Naomi's face. She was a black woman, mid-30s, well-groomed but obviously tired from a long drive. Hallie felt an inexplicable surge of annoyance. Naomi offered a polite nod. "Good evening, officer." Her voice was calm, practiced. She'd dealt with all manner of authority figures, from generals to commanding officers, and had learned that a respectful tone often diffused tension. "Driver's license and registration," Hallie barked, shining his flashlight into her eyes. He wanted her off balance. Still calm, she handed them over. "Here you are, sir." Hallie took them without a word and stepped back to his patrol car. He shoved the documents into his laptop's card reader, not bothering to read the name carefully. If he had, he might have noticed the small detail that her driver's license photo was taken on a military base, or at least recognized the significance of the letters LTC on her registration. Though it wasn't always standard for a personal vehicle, some states allowed military rank designations on certain documents. Hallie's system took a moment to process the license and registration. Naomi's record was, of course, squeaky clean. No infractions other than a few minor speeding tickets from a decade ago. Hallie rubbed his chin. That wasn't enough to satisfy him. He decided he would question her about the vehicle's ownership. But before returning to the SUV, Hallie took a mental inventory of all the ways he could escalate the situation. He felt a strange need to demonstrate his authority, to show that in this county, he was in charge. When Hallie came back, he didn't hand the papers over right away. Instead, he aimed the flashlight directly at Naomi's face again. "What are you doing driving this SUV out here at this hour?" Naomi blinked against the beam of light. "I'm on my way to my hometown to visit family. It's late, so the road's a bit empty, but I'm not speeding." Hallie ignored her measured tone. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" She glanced at him, reading his body language. Naomi had encountered hostility in foreign lands, during intelligence missions, and she recognized the undercurrent of tension in Hallie's stance. Technically, she could refuse unless he had probable cause. She also knew how quickly such refusals turned dangerous in confrontations with officers like him. With a deep breath, she nodded. "All right, officer." She opened the door and stepped onto the gravel shoulder. The night air was colder than she expected. Her boots crunched on the loose stones. Hallie stood at an angle, his hand close to his holstered gun. "Hands where I can see them," Hallie snapped. Naomi complied, lifting her hands slightly as she turned to face him. The irony of it all struck her. She had spent her life defending the freedoms of Americans, including the uniform this officer wore, and yet she stood here, hands raised, being treated like a criminal. Hallie's eyes roved over her quickly. "This your car?" Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir. The registration is in my name." Hallie squinted at the papers in his hand, finally reading them properly. "Naomi Green," he read out loud. "This says you're a..." Lieutenant Colonel? He sneered at the word. What are you, in the Army? She met his gaze. Yes, sir. U.S. Army, military intelligence. He let out a cold laugh. Yeah, sure you are. Got a uniform on you? She shook her head. I'm on leave, heading to my father's for his birthday. I'm not wearing my uniform. Hallie took a step closer. Naomi suppressed the instinctual desire to step back. In her training, stepping back was a sign of fear, or might provoke escalation from a hostile. She stood firm but non-threatening. Ma'am, I need you to turn around, he said as though she were a suspect. I'm going to pat you down for weapons. She blinked. Is there a reason you suspect I'm armed or dangerous? She asked calmly. Hallie's upper lip curled. It's standard procedure, he said dismissively, although it wasn't standard for a simple traffic stop without cause. Naomi briefly considered resisting or asking for a supervisor, but the tension in Hallie's voice told her that refusing would only make things worse. Gritting her teeth, she turned around and allowed him to pat her down. His touch was rough, and she felt an anger rising in her chest. She had faced enemy soldiers, terrorists, and foreign agents, but this felt more degrading. This was supposed to be home. All right, Hallie said. Keep those hands out where I can see them. Don't move unless I say. Naomi exhaled slowly. This was quickly escalating from a traffic stop to something far more sinister. And it was clear that this officer had no idea whom he was dealing with, nor the training she possessed to handle intense situations. Behind Naomi's calm eyes, 1,000 strategies flickered. She wondered how far Hallie intended to push this, and how she might have to respond if he crossed a line. For now, she did what she did best. She observed. She collected data, memorizing Hallie's nameplate, noticing the slight tremor in his left hand, the scuffed toes of his boots, the way his radio crackled with static from dispatch. She noted the direction of the wind, the lights of the nearest gas station about a mile ahead, and she realized that if Hallie decided to do something truly unhinged, they were very much alone. Drama was unfolding step by step, and she was certain that it was far from over. Officer Hallie forced Naomi to remain standing beside her vehicle for nearly 15 minutes, while he performed what he called a thorough investigation. He opened every compartment of her SUV, rifling through her belongings without permission. Naomi knew that legally he should have had probable cause or her consent to search her vehicle, but he had demanded she remain silent and still. Her mind churned with conflicting emotions. She wanted to speak up, to assert her rights, but she also knew how quickly things could escalate, especially if the officer carried any deep-seated animosity. If Hallie found anything, even benign items, he might twist it into a reason to arrest her. Finally, Hallie shut the last compartment. He walked back around to where Naomi stood, his face twisted in a smug grin. You planning to tell me why you need so much gear in your trunk? Naomi had a standard army duffel bag with some personal items, spare clothes, and a few field manuals. She also had an old tactical vest that wasn't exactly standard issue but had sentimental value. I'm military, she repeated. I just got back from overseas. Those are my personal effects. Hallie's shoulders shook with a short laugh. Uh-huh, and I'm the President of the United States. Naomi clenched her jaw. Officer, if you run my identification properly, you'll see my service record is legitimate. I've broken no laws. I'd appreciate my documents returned and the opportunity to continue my journey. He stared at her for a long moment, seemingly impressed by her composure but unwilling to cede any ground. He turned and spat on the gravel. Wait here, he commanded, stepping back toward his patrol car. She exhaled, letting her rigid stance loosen just enough to shake out her nerves. Even though she was highly trained, even though she had faced real combat, this scenario felt personal. This was her own country, her home, and it still felt so unwelcoming sometimes. Minutes ticked by. On the side of the road, the night sky stretched wide, punctuated by distant stars. The sense of isolation weighed on Naomi. She could feel eyes on her. Hallie's beady stare from the patrol car. The radio crackle whispered half-heard words, an unintelligible conversation with dispatch. Her phone was in the SUV, lying on the driver's seat where she'd left it before exiting. She wondered if it would be wise to record the encounter, but she feared that making a sudden move toward the phone might provoke Hallie even further. Eventually, Hallie stepped out of his cruiser again. This time, he slammed the car door behind him with unnecessary force. He stalked over, brandishing her documents in one hand. "Well," he said, "it seems your license checks out. The registration is valid, so you're free to go, I guess." The grudging tone in his voice indicated he hadn't found any reason to justify further detainment, but he still wasn't happy about it. Naomi felt relief start to blossom in her chest, but it was laced with a potent anger that this ordeal had happened at all. She reached out to take her license and registration. Hallie yanked them back before she could grasp them, as though enjoying the moment of psychological control. Then he flicked them into the gravel at her feet. "Pick 'em up!" Shock flared in her eyes. She wanted to demand an apology, to hold this man accountable. But the moment she opened her mouth, Hallie stepped closer again, trying to loom over her. "Let's not have any trouble now," he said, that smug grin returning. "We wouldn't want any kind of accident on the side of the road." Naomi's training told her that any confrontation here could spiral out of control. The best recourse would be to document and report him to the right authorities later. So forcing down her pride, she bent down and picked up the papers. "Have a good night," Hallie said, feigning politeness. "Next time, don't drive around looking like a drug runner." Naomi froze. She glanced at him, the words stinging, but said nothing. Instead, she moved slowly back to her SUV, got in, and closed the door. She started the engine, her hands trembling in a way they hadn't in years. As she pulled away from the shoulder, Hallie remained in his squad car, the red and blue lights rotating in the night. Naomi watched him in her rearview mirror until he was a pinprick of color fading behind her. She was no stranger to racism, nor to the abuse of power, but having it happen so brazenly left her furious. She swallowed the anger, reminding herself that there were official channels to handle such misconduct. Perhaps she would talk to her father about it. He might advise her or know people in the local law enforcement community who could help. But the incident had shaken her. Even as she merged back onto the highway, she couldn't dispel that swirling mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. The scathing words he'd hurled at her, accusing her of looking like a criminal, made her question how many other innocent people had suffered under his bullying. Naomi was determined it would not end here. She'd done covert operations on foreign soil. She had compiled evidence against potential threats to national security. If she needed to compile her own personal intelligence case against Officer Hallie, she was more than qualified to do so. Little did she know this was only the beginning of their confrontation. Fate had a curious way of bringing people back together, under circumstances far more explosive than anyone could anticipate. Naomi finally arrived at her father's house in the early hours of the morning. The small suburban home had a porch light on, and she saw a shadow pass by the front window. She parked in the driveway, forcing a weary smile for the benefit of her father, who stood at the door wearing his old robe, clearly worried. As soon as she stepped inside, her father's eyes ran over her face, noting the tension in her expression. "You okay, baby girl?" he asked, his voice a hushed rumble. "It's late. Was getting worried." Naomi forced a smile, pulling him into a hug. "I'm fine, Dad. Ran into a bit of a problem on the road." He guided her into the living room. Naomi noticed the faint odor of night coffee, evidence that her father had been waiting up, sipping from an old mug that read, "Best Dad in the Marines." As they sat down, Naomi explained what happened. The humiliating stop, Officer Hallie's intimidation, the search of her vehicle, the hateful insinuations. Her father, retired Sergeant Major James Green, listened in silence, his jaw tight and his eyes filled with rage. "That son of a—" he began, then caught himself. He took a breath and clenched his fists. "Some things never change. It's unbelievable that you've risked your life overseas. You've served your country with honor, and you still get treated like—" This. Naomi sighed, resting her elbows on her knees. I'm not the only one, Dad. This kind of abuse happens to people all the time, especially to people who look like us. James nodded, swallowing his anger. And you said the officer's name was Hallie? Officer Brent Hallie. That's what his nameplate said, Naomi replied. James's eyes flickered. I'm going to make some calls tomorrow morning. We can file a complaint. We can get a lawyer if we have to. Naomi ran a hand over her short, neatly trimmed hair. I've never been one to be vengeful. But Dad, this was more than just a typical traffic stop. There was so much hatred in his eyes. Her father pursed his lips. Hate. That's the right word for it. Listen, you're only here for a short time, yeah? We can push for a formal investigation. We'll get your record out there, your rank, your service awards, everything. And if that officer tries to deny it, we'll show them who you really are. Naomi slumped back against the couch, exhaustion wearing on her. Thanks, Dad. Maybe you're right. If we let this go, he'll keep doing it. Darn right, James said. Now you go get some rest. We'll celebrate my birthday properly, but let's handle this first. If we don't stand up to officers like him, who will? A small smile curled the corners of Naomi's mouth. She leaned over to squeeze her father's hand. All right, Dad, I'll rest. But first thing tomorrow, we start making calls. She did just that. She rose early, took a shower to wash away the grime of the previous night's journey, and joined her father at the kitchen table. He was already on the phone, speaking in low tones with someone from the local Veterans Affairs office. When he saw Naomi, he held up a finger, acknowledging her. James said into the phone. Yes, she is a lieutenant colonel. That's correct. We need to file a formal complaint. Yes, we'll do that. He hung up and turned to Naomi. They're putting me in touch with a legal advisor who handles civil rights complaints. In the meantime, we can file a complaint directly with the police department. Naomi nodded. Let's do it. By midday, they had driven to the local police station, a squat single-story building with a flagpole out front. It was ironically close to the elementary school Naomi had attended as a child. She recognized the neighborhood, though it had changed over the years. Inside, they spoke to a duty sergeant named Jim Warner, who listened intently to Naomi's story. The entire time, Naomi noticed his expression shifting from interest to worry as she mentioned Hallie's name. Officer Hallie, Warner said, leaning back in his chair. He was a heavy-set man, hair thinning, with a calm demeanor. He's only been with us a couple of years. He transferred from a different county. We've had a few concerns raised about his conduct, but nothing official. Naomi exchanged a glance with her father. I'd like to make it official, she said. Warner nodded. Understood. Let's get this complaint on record. Naomi provided a detailed, written statement while her father watched, tension lining his face. She included everything from Hallie's intimidation tactics to the humiliating way he threw her license and registration